Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our 32nd version of Cannabusiness Live. Hey, look at us in the corner over there. A little technical snafu, but here we are. Welcome, everybody. This will be our last Cannabusiness Live for the 2017 year. We're pretty excited to just talk all things to do with the medical marijuana market here in Michigan. I'm Craig Aronoff, along with my colleague Travis Copenhaver, and we're with the Cannabis Legal Group in Royal Oak, Michigan. We are going to be talking about municipalities today and just kind of having a general discussion. So to the extent that we'd love to have you like us, share us, tell your friends about us, ask us questions, engage it. We'd appreciate the feedback. Today we're going to kind of go over a number of different things with respect to ordinances around the state, just some things we've seen, show you our map and kind of walk through our map with you. And then, hopefully answer some questions. So why don't we just talk generally about the state as a whole? Sure. You just wrote an article recently, and I think it's kind of timely with respect to what we'll talk about today.
Sure. So just by way of reminder, getting a license to operate as one of the 5 marijuana businesses in Michigan is a 2-step process. You need local municipal approval, and then that's part of your overall state license application. What the local municipality gets to do is they get to define the types of businesses that are going to be allowed in their community, and then they get to zone the location of those businesses. When you hear about how a new city is allowing 10 dispensaries or something along those lines, what's happening is that community has passed an ordinance. That ordinance dictates the number of businesses allowed and where in their community those businesses can be. That is going to involve things such as what zoning district you're allowed to be in, if there's buffers from schools or churches or parks or something along those lines. All of that is defined by your local community. Once you go through whatever process they have to select their businesses, if they are only going to allow 5 dispensaries, for example, there needs to be some way for that community to decide which 5 are going to be the ones that are awarded that privilege. Once you obtain that approval, that's what goes into step 2 of your state license application. Whereas step 1 being your pre-qualification, the collection of your history, your financial and criminal background, etc. Step 2 is very much about the facility itself. And one of the first things they ask for in step 2 is 2 things. A copy of the ordinance allowing marijuana businesses in that community, and then whatever permission you got from that community to be one of those businesses. So when you're pursuing one of these opportunities, if you would like to set up a cannabis business, one of the first things you should be thinking about is where you would like to do that. There are going to be a lot of factors, economic factors that are going to make sense for different businesses. If you're running a provisioning center, for example, that's a retail point of sale. You need to have someone around you to purchase it. So if you're in the middle of nowhere, you might be allowed to be there, but there might be no one coming to purchase from you. But from a licensing, a compliance, a legal perspective, what you need to look to is the ordinance that a community's passed. And that's what our map helps us do.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. And just with respect to, provisioning centers, and you were describing how, if you're in a remote area, it might be hard to find one. I think that kind of looks at why communities are making decisions that they're making, as a whole. As we've talked to communities all throughout the state, both large ones, small ones, literally, as small a town as you can imagine, I think we both put our feet into over the course of the last year. And what we've seen is that they really look at the profile of what kind of fits their community. If it's an agricultural town, they're used to growing an agricultural product. It's easy to talk about greenhouse grows and things that don't involve a lot of concrete. On the other hand, they might not think that a dispensary makes sense, since they literally might only have one stoplight and a gas station is the only commercial business in their whole town.
Right.
And so when we go into these communities, it's important that you, even if you live there, kind of look around you and say, what makes sense? Granted, we don't want somebody to have to drive an hour to go to a dispensary, but maybe there's something that's a little more urban nearby, or a little more, commercialized for purposes of having enough traffic to justify putting up a store and the cost and everything that's associated with it. And so we're going to see a lot of different things throughout the course of the year. It was just in the paper the other day talking about how we have just a handful of, communities that have opted in. We've talked about this in the past, that, with the rules coming out in December and the application now, I think it's easy to see, and we're already on agendas coming into January. We're going to see a lot more communities kind of take a new approach with this. and maybe not have the fear mongering that we've seen before. While some may continue with their prohibitionist view, maybe the communities around them will kind of step up, and that's what we're hoping to see, and what we've been working a lot on. With respect to that, we've developed on our website at cannabislegalgroup.com /municipalities a really great thing, and I think all props go out to Ryan Battisil, our guru here at the office, for helping us build this a phenomenal resource for ourselves and our clients. And what I'm going to do here, with hopefully trying not to screw up the
We're not IT experts, so it might take us a second to get this going here.
Right. Let's see, the source is the script.
Yep, that
one. Right, there we go. So now that we're in on this screen, this is our cannabislegalgroup.com /municipalities. The way that the site works, of course, is it pushes to our back end. And what you'll see as you scroll down is that we have a municipal list. There's an opportunity, if you haven't already done so, you can put your name in, your email address. Like we've asked you in the past, we really want to take a lot of feedback from people, so that you might know of a community that's not on our map here below. But the legend on the left talks about opted in, talks about drafting, all these towns that you'll see in red that have opted out as well. But what we want to do is make sure that we try to get as much of the coverage in Michigan as we can. As we scroll down further, you'll see that we have it in a written form where you can go through it. So, Travis, why don't you take a minute and kind of help us walk through that page, if you would?
Sure. So let's go up to the map first. So I think one of the main pieces of value you could get from this site is just seeing what's happening here. And before we get too far into this, I really want to commend most of the municipalities that are popping up here, because it was a pretty tall order to put an ordinance on the books over the last several months while we were waiting for the state to do its portion. The state did a great job as well, but some of these early adopters here, some of the ones who drafted some of these first ordinances, are going to get basically repurposed, used, and built upon by everyone who comes after them. And they a lot of work went into them at the local level, and I think we should mention that. But what you want to look here for is, we tried to color code it to make sense. From our point of view, green means that community is allowing medical marijuana businesses. Maybe not all of them, maybe not a lot of them, but some form of marijuana business is allowed in that area. Red is a community that has indicated to us in some official way that they're not going to be allowing marijuana businesses, which is the default if a community is silent and has no ordinance on the books. But several communities have passed a resolution or made it very clear that that's not something that's going to change in the future, at least until they change their minds overall. And then yellow is our communities that have taken the step to draft ordinances or to explore the issue in a way that seems like they may be willing to opt in the future, but there hasn't really been a commitment as to whether or not that's something that community is going to decide to do.
Well, let me break it off there and just talk about that for a moment. You and I have both been in a lot of communities. We walk out of there and we have a sense as we leave sometimes like that this is going to work. Let's continue at it, or we just hit a wall. Let's take our bruises and go on to the next town. And doing our best to, of course, read the tea leaves for our clients so that we know where to put their time, effort, and energy. The yellows are very curious because those are places where there's been activity, there's been items on the agenda, maybe items that have been long on the agenda. We think about Kalamazoo and Battle Creek and Portage that, if you look in the paper, you'll see them in the news in the early spring, contemplating these facilities, and yet nothing's done. They're still yellow. So where do you feel like our line is drawn in the sand? Is it purely opted out, or is them telling us they're not going to opt in? Is it no interest in the agenda? Describe how we designate those two things.
Yeah, well, so something has to occur on paper, in my mind, to indicate that community is not going to move forward with an ordinance or participate in the program. So the typical form that takes is a resolution of some sort where they basically flat out say, we're not going to allow marijuana businesses, stop asking us. This industry has been very excited, and rightfully so. It's a great opportunity for a lot of newcomers and old marijuana people as well to move into a new situation. And I know a lot of the clerks of different municipalities that I've worked with, they hear the word marijuana and their eyes roll, because I think every clerk in every municipality in our state has probably been asked about what their community is doing for medical marijuana. And in some of our more populated areas, some of the locations a lot of businesses want to be, they've probably been asked so many times, know their community is not going to do something, and they've probably encouraged their community to be, actively stating, hey, we're not going to allow this to happen. Because if you look at all the gray areas on our map, some of those communities might be at a status we're not aware of, but silence is not going to allow communities to participate.
Right.
So they need to actually pass an ordinance allowing a type of business in order for those businesses to exist there. So the vast majority of our state doesn't allow medical marijuana businesses in the MMFLA program. But what red is if a community has done something beyond that to indicate that they aren't going to even consider the issue in the future.
Right. So those are basically the areas where we've kind of, turned and, if we get, something in the future that says we're reconsidering our past position, you might see us go back there. And I can say this, and this is something I think is true in your experience as well. We've been told by a number of communities, quote, we've opted out. And then a couple of months went by, and in casual conversation, because we're always continuing to have conversations with a lot of these communities, they recognize that we're not the people to be concerned with, we'll say, as far as annoying them, maybe. But the reality is we get from them, we do have a draft. We have been working on it in the background. We opted out just to be left alone for a while so we can figure out what we want to do. And you can't fault those supervisors from taking that approach of how do we quiet the phones?
Right.
How do we not have our staff deal with this until we know what we want? And, and I think that's what we'll start to see too, is maybe even some of these reds basically reconsidering their position and so on throughout the course of, the calendar year that we'll be having coming up,
right? And
especially as licensing comes online.
Exactly. And nothing is set in stone. Any community that's in red right now can flip to green with the same ordinance passed by any community that's been silent. You see some communities, I think Sumter Township, for example, we have in red right now because they did, pass an ordinance repealing some older ordinances they had on their books. And one line in that, action was, we're not participating in the MMFLA at this time. However, they've been holding, community workshops on how they will be opting in potentially in the future.
Yeah, they've been studying it too in this, they call it the exploratory committee, and we'll see what comes of that. As I scrolled down a moment ago, you notice that there's a list of, and I want to point this out just real briefly. As you scroll over a community on here, you'll see that we can click on it in order to obtain more data. So that's what the interactive portion of the map offers. Now, if we scroll down, however, and we get to a list, you'll see that we have ordinances and visit website. I think it's important for us to point out, it's not our goal to tell everybody the entire detail. What we want to do is offer a resource that is verifiable. So the links are intended to say, this is what we've seen. Here's where you can verify it for yourself. Here's the ordinance itself or the website for the community, and or some actual articles written by MLive or some other resources that have publicized the decisions of the community. And so we're trying to draw from a wide range of information, but what we want people to realize is this is the beginning of your due diligence. It's by no means the end. What does the ordinance say? How many is the ordinance actually just a police power ordinance versus a zoning ordinance? And that's actually something that there's a lot of confusion on. So why don't we address that for a moment so people can understand? Right.
So what happens when a community is passing an ordinance is they first effectively need to satisfy section, I think it's 205 of the MMFLA that says they need an ordinance allowing businesses to exist. That's traditionally finding itself in a police power ordinance. A police power ordinance is going to say, we're allowing these types of businesses. A lot of times it'll say, we're going to allow 2 of this business, 3 of this business, none of this business, or something along those lines. What a zoning ordinance is then is the location a type of business like that is allowed to occur. Most communities have different zoning districts. They might have an industrial district, a residential district, a community commercial business district. They have all different kinds of names. And depending on how that community is set up its zoning ordinance, Maybe they'll do specific rules for different types of businesses in different sections of their zoning ordinance. Other communities will have sections specifically for types of businesses, and then inside of it, it'll say if you're in the industrial district, you have to have this much parking, this much square footage, you have to be this much in your setbacks, and for businesses like medical marijuana, that's where you're a lot of times going to see your buffer requirements. You have to be 1,000 feet away from a school. Well, what does 1,000 feet mean? Is that property line to property line? Is that outermost building to property line? Is that like the city of Lansing has done? Take a 90-degree angle from your outermost building, go to the middle of the intersection, do the same for the church or school, go to the middle of the intersection, and then measure the 2 points from the road. I mean, regardless, whatever the rule is, you find that in the zoning ordinance. So you have to look to a lot of places. Some communities, smaller communities oftentimes, won't necessarily have two separate ordinances. They'll have all of their zoning requirements in the same ordinance that allows the use itself. In a community that allows these businesses to exist and doesn't have a lot of zoning restrictions, you might not even see any zoning language. What's important to know is whatever community you're working in is going to have its own set of rules that you're going to have to comply with. And there's not a one-size-fit-all kind of scenario. You can't be an expert in the city of Lansing's requirements and expect that to apply in a Bay City or a Flint or a Detroit.
Well, let's break it off from there for a moment, because in Detroit, I'm glad I caught you right at that word, because that's obviously a hot topic item around the state of Michigan. And I think what I'm going to do here is just flip us back to the live screen so that we can just talk for a minute on camera. So Detroit is a hot mess. I think that's the best description. But what happened is, as we talk about ordinances, let's break it down just to the bare bones and give like a Cliff Notes version of what really happened. We have two ordinances that were enacted by a ballot measure, ballot A, ballot B. Ballot A is that police power ordinance you just described. Ballot A said the city of Detroit is opting in to participate in the 5 licenses available under the MMFLA. And so that ballot initiative was something that, by the statutes allowing city residents to help determine their fate for purposes of ordinances, that was available for a ballot initiative. On the other hand, ballot B, which is the zoning changes, that's the one that has some questions on it. And there's a statute called the Land Enabling Act that basically dictates from the state of Michigan how each community can determine its own zoning. And so, as we just talked about how these ordinances have 2 phases to it, while one is we want to opt in, the other retains control in the board or the councils to determine for themselves how they want that city map to look. And it's questionable, of course, the raised question now is whether or not ballot B on the zoning that reduces the 1,000 foot to everything, including liquor stores and churches and daycares, to 500 feet to schools and churches, and basically reduces all the rest of it, eliminates it, whether or not that could be done by ballot initiative. And so that's sort of the quandary we're in, is we don't know if it'll get certified yet. We don't know what that final outcome, but it's a great example how even in the biggest city in our state, these 2 different components of the ordinances are really handled independent of one another. So no matter how small the community is, there's still that factor. It doesn't matter that there's 700 people in the town. The town still has to decide where it wants different type of businesses. And so if you think that just because they opted in that everything you're going to touch is somehow going to be viable, I think you need to then take a step back and say, all right, let's confirm that. What do we need to do to find out from a zoning administrator or a local city manager, or possibly contacting us to delve into the ordinance language with you and go through the process to confirm it.
Right, and that's a different amount of work from one community to the next. I mean, it can be something very, very simple in one community and something incredibly difficult to parse through in another. Each community has, in its zoning ordinance, a set of rules about how they're supposed to do things. They need to follow those rules. And sometimes a community might kind of gloss over what the process should have been for a variety of different reasons to get to some point for a new type of use like this. I mean, there isn't a lot of other industries that just create a brand new controversial type of use like the marijuana industry has. Now we've had, patients and caregivers in our state for the last several years, and I think a lot of communities, whether they did so in an appropriate way or not, kind of came to terms with that and figured out how they wanted to deal with those types of activities in their communities. But this was brand new, a brand new use defined by a statute that we've had a little over a year now. And it's, a lot of unanswered questions. I mean, we had 28 pages of statute, but there are a lot of, items about how this is actually going to operate that no one was quite aware of. And a lot of communities did their best, but acting without the entire set of facts is going to lead to some growing pains. If you look at some of the early adopter communities, you've seen that they've made amendments to those early.
Let's talk about like Bangor, for instance.
Sure.
That's a good example.
Yep. Well, Bangor Township, I believe, was one of the first 5. I don't think it was the first 3.
Right.
Very early on, and it was certainly one of the communities to start accepting applications. I think it might have been the first to start accepting them, or Pinconning, one of the two. And there was a lot of excitement because that was really the only place you could get to that point of the process for a long time. And they started accepting applications, and then we started learning more and more and more from the state as they were issuing their bulletins and talking about what the regulations were going to start looking like, what the requirements were going to start looking like. But back in the summer of, when Bangor was trying to do the municipal approvals, which the statute clearly allows them to do, they were, they had, I believe, was Bangor the one that had a bunch of Class A licenses? The theory being they'd get more applicants to stack Class A's. Then we learned, well, Class A's can't be stacked, only Class C's can. So they rewrote their rules to allow a bunch of Class C's.
What was really cool was actually, while they were approving applications from submitted applicants, they actually amended their ordinance on the record that day to increase the number of licenses available for different classes of licenses. In other words, I think what they really recognized was that the interest was higher than maybe they anticipated. The value of their land started to prosper better than they had thought. And of course, co-location and stacking bulletins came out in late September. We kind of altered, the framework of the existing ordinance. There's also been a lot of talk about, everybody's assuming certain communities have opted in when they hadn't yet. And one that I've done a lot of work in is Ann Arbor. The most progressive city, probably fairly stated in the state, liberal or whatnot. But one that has always kind of, it was a home for medical marijuana. They always, as we all know, growing up with hash bash and other things, they were an open community to it and didn't really police it the way, say, a more conservative town would, say Grand Rapids or whatnot. What's interesting is they just finalized their ordinance the other day. It wasn't like they've been way out in front of this. It was well thought through. They have a police power ordinance on record. They have now a zoning ordinance. But transitionally, it's been, even in that kind of community where they made a lot of effort, it took a lot of time. Mm-hmm. And so even in these smaller communities that are biting on it and maybe considering it, we have to give them the patience to make it theirs. And we've been doing that as well, because we can talk to, small communities where we've seen, slow steps and slow consideration up till now as well. But I guess the tenor of the conversation is a couple-fold. Number one is use the map as a resource. That's it. It begins the due diligence. Mm-hmm. Ask questions locally to your current attorneys, to your realtors. Dig in deep. Make sure that, first of all, the place that says you're in Bay City as an address is not actually in Bangor. Right. Because a lot of communities, the township address is not where you're at.
Mailing address is not necessarily a jurisdiction.
Right. Google doesn't necessarily give you exact measurements if you're using the measure from here tools. It's a resource, but you still have to go and do the legwork to make sure, especially if it's questionably close. So don't just assume things going in. Make deals that are contingent. Mm-hmm. We can do option offers. We can do purchase agreements without clauses. We can have different conditional levels that say earnest money goes hard upon township zoning approval, and then it's closed upon state approval, or whatever we need to do in order to buy sufficient time to negotiate a closing that makes sense, that people can use the property for what they want. And so we have to, keep that yellow flag up until we know for sure, and then you got to bite. Mm-hmm. And that's one piece of advice that I think is very important as well. It's action time. Mm-hmm. If you're close and you're still kicking tires, it's time to take a risk maybe and buy something or get involved in a contract, because licensing is happening and time is something where the sooner you have part 2 of municipal approval, there's only a handful of them right now at the state level. you could be one of the early operators going.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned timing, because another thing you should be sensitive to in an ordinance is what your deadlines and timelines are going to be.
Yes.
If a community is only allowing 2 provisioning centers, well, what happens if you're the third to the table? That community is going to define, typically in its ordinance, how that selection process is going to occur. A lot of these selection processes might be based on a criteria decision the community is going to make, but that's not always the case. We've seen communities do lotteries where you have a window of time to submit an application, and then they'll draw everyone who qualifies. They draw the winners out of a hat. Some communities just kind of have a first come first serve situation. In a smaller community that might not have a cap necessarily on the books, a lot of times what happens is their buffers or their zoning districts are so small that there's only a few parcels anyway. So if you really want to be in a community and you haven't locked down property yet, well, there might not be any left. So understanding where you want to be is very important, because there are some communities on our map here that are in green that already decided what their 25 or 2 provisioning center applicants are going to be. Now, there might be an opportunity to get in the queue if any of them fail to obtain their license eventually. But take Lansing, for example. Lansing's going to allow 25 provisioning centers. Well, the deadline to submit an application to be one of those 25 is come and gone. So if you want to be a provisioning center in Lansing, you're going to have to wait until you can maybe purchase one of the winners, or get in the queue and wait for some of them to not succeed, or encourage Lansing to allow more people to participate. Anytime you see an ordinance with a rule or a restriction that's unfavorable to you, that doesn't mean it's set in stone forever. You have the opportunity to talk to that community and encourage them to be more inclusive.
Yeah, I think Bangor is a great example of that. I mean, one of the things they did is they started off with 6 provisioning centers and then amended it to 15 when they recognized that, there was the interest, there was the ability to provide patient access, and quite frankly, there was, the opportunity to do their business in their town, and that's what they were looking to do, is bring this commerce there. Contrast Lansing's approach is, maybe I'll again point back to Ann Arbor, which looked at it from a buffering of zoning just for provisioning centers. So instead of putting a number on it, what they determined is that 600 feet is a good buffer. I think in the downtown district it might be a little tighter, and you might find a handful more. And then as you go out into the outer areas of the city, the truth is there's just not a lot of real estate anyway. And so, but by buffering it with 600 feet, it'll come up with a number by the end, and the water line will kind of find its mark and what the right balance is for the city over time with the success of these businesses, rather than Lansing's approach of just saying, well, we think 25 is the right number and we'll kind of pick and choose where and how, and the market itself won't determine that. And I think that those two kind of competing versions, how Detroit comes out in the end still remains to be seen. Over time, Michigan might, as a whole, the markets might kind of adopt one of the other approaches or kind of morph. I mean, in time, it wouldn't surprise me to see Lansing morph. Yeah. And maybe either add more or change it to a buffer restriction or something that makes more sense.
Another thing to keep in mind as well is there are more and more municipalities coming online with new ordinances every day. So if you spend $500,000 fighting tooth and nail to get one of 2 available slots in a community, who's to say that was money well spent when the community next door might have unlimited licenses 4 months from now?
That's very true.
So what your approach is, where you want to be, shouldn't be guided by our map or what are available right now alone. You should be doing research to decide not only is the location good to operate the business you're pursuing in general, is that community going to cause you cost based on the regulatory restrictions they have in place to find one of those homes to meet their zoning requirements. There's a lot of places your business aspirations can be bottlenecked by regulation. You see that happen at every level of government. I mean, the federal laws bottleneck the entire marijuana industry. Our state regulations are going to stop things like delivery services, that are available in other states. So if you came to Michigan hoping to operate an amazing delivery service like you see in California and other places, well, guess what? You're not allowed to do it. The same thing's going to apply when you start getting to local laws as well. You might want to be at the highway stop next to the gas station where everyone going north on 75 is going to have to stop and get gas because it's a great spot. But if that community is not going to let you be there, maybe it's not a community for you. Maybe you need to look elsewhere. I can't tell you where to go. One business a community might be perfect for them, and a business seeking the very same type of license but having a different approach might be a terrible place for you. So having an understanding about, it's great that you want to be a marijuana business, whatever one of the 5 you're pursuing. But what type of business are you going to run? Because a license type is a label. Take a processor license, for example. Are you going to be a kitchen making edibles? Or are you going to be extraction? They're both processors, but they're really completely different activities. Maybe you can do both, but do you need to? I mean, a lot of factors like that determine what locations work for you. Provisioning center in a rural community might need to operate differently than one that is in a community that has 25 of them, and you're kind of competing internally to the city. What your business is, location is key. That should be your first, second, and third concern. Yeah. And when you're making a location decision, your municipality is going to define the rules you have to play by.
And the other thing too, and we talked a minute ago about Lansing and stuff, and one thing we got to keep in mind too is for a long time now, Lansing's been the single source of marijuana in the center of our state in servicing patient populations that extend maybe an hour to 2 hours away from the downtown city center. In the future, there's going to be access to medicine in many of those communities an hour away. And so maybe there's not as much patient draw to the city as there used to be because there's more access elsewhere. The other thing too is to keep in mind that, these yellows and these reds that are on here, there's no saying that you can't continue to have the grounding. They can opt in at any time in the future. So if you have something tied up and you're still continuing to engage that community, that there is a play that says 6, 8, 10, a year from now, then you are able to go and pursue it. And so patience is not going to be harmful here, but, and it might prove itself to be very helpful for people to find that gem in the rough that, you're waiting on. But I think action is also important. When you're reading those tea leaves and you're working with them, locking it up, going to a community and saying, I already own property here. I already have an interest here. I'm not just kicking a tire, walking through, and if you make a decision, I might be elsewhere anyway. That's very important as to how you engage these communities, is what trust they have in you, right, that you're the operator that they're doing the work for in the future. And
trust is key. Like if you are talking, if you are talking to your community and you want to work with them, they don't have to be the bad guy. They don't have to be if you take an adversarial approach, they're not going to do you any favors. But if you're in a small community, for whatever reason, maybe you're from there, maybe you have another reason to be there, reaching out to them and telling them how you want to run your business might encourage them to assist you. If you want to run a provisioning center and you're in a small community and you have a good reason for wanting to be there, well, perhaps you should share it with them. If there's a lot of, I'm sure we all are aware, marijuana isn't universally accepted. And a lot of these communities are dealing with marijuana for the very first time. So dealing with skepticism is definitely a challenge. But, once you start breaking down those barriers through education, through trust, through getting to know them, if they want to help you, they can. I mean, they can do a lot of things that make your life a nightmare too. So building those relationships is really important.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Now, there's one question that I wanted to address real quick. Christina Allison asked, how's the state going to determine its fees? The only fee that's actually determined right now is for a Class A license is capped at $10,000. That's a statutory figure. It's the only figure put into the ordinance or the law itself. The projection from law up till now has been that the high end of the fee structure will be at $57,000. And I think we're going to kind of see as time goes on where that number settles in. They haven't really made a determination yet, or a specific number of licenses of different types. The way they treat the capitalization, where processors, provisioning centers, and Class B all kind of line up the same, just kind of thinking out loud, it wouldn't surprise me to see their license fees be the same, Class C being the one that's different, and then transporter and security, secured facilities being some hybrid of it all. Time will tell. We just have to be patient and make those determinations. For your purposes and your business planning, come in high on the number, and then be capitalized with more money than you need possibly, or not borrow what you were going to use, or whatever the framework is for that relationship. Just be prepared. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we'd love to answer that question, but we don't have an answer yet. Just to clarify, there are 2 fees you'll be paying to the state. We do know for sure every licensee is going to submit a $6,000 original application fee. And then the fee that she was asking about is called a regulatory assessment fee. And that's the one that's based on the number of licenses awarded. When we're getting the numbers between 10,000 and 57,000 that the state's projected, that's based on the number of licenses that are awarded that year. So because we can't know how many licenses there are, the state can't tell us what that fee is going to be. And what the process is for when they determine how many licenses there have been and what that fee gets broken down into, we'd love to be able to tell our clients with more accuracy, but I haven't seen it anywhere yet.
No, it'll come soon. And, and I think in time, just like a lot of things we've done over the last year, we've been talking about what we think the state might do. And I think those have watched our videos and have talked to us. I think we've done a pretty good job of really helping to forecast and be where we're at right now. The rules weren't surprising to us. A lot of things in it we expected. The application itself and how it's working is a trick, but it's online and there's ways through it. And you just got to get more efficient at it over time. But you know what? I think it's an exciting time for the state of Michigan. I think the year is ending with a fabulous opportunity for 2018. I'm no less excited today than I was when I first started here at the Cannabis Legal Group, because you know what? That map is going to continue to look like a Christmas tree in terms of, all the different colors lighting up. And it's going to be pretty exciting over the course of next year. Well, we talked for a while today. So, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us on our Facebook page at Cannabis Legal Group, or you can find us at cannabislegalgroup.com. Our map is at, cannabislegalgroup.com/municipalities. And so I hope everybody has a happy, safe, and healthy new year. And we'll look forward to seeing you for our first show right after the new year, probably that Friday, and we'll talk about new things coming in 2018.
Definitely. Well, happy holidays, everyone. Happy New Year.
Yeah, so for Craig Aronoff and Travis Copenhaver, have a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.